In an extremely unexpected turn of events, the rate of UK inflation fell in August, despite economists' fears that it would rise to well over 7%. The Office for National Statistics reported that inflation dropped to 6.7% last month, compared to 6.8% in July. The outcome has been attributed to slower increases in the cost of food. At 6.7%, inflation is now remarkably at its lowest rate since February 2022. As the Bank of England was beginning to face pressure to increase interest rates further, the surprise fall in inflation now throws its next move into question. All of this comes as a new study by the Children's Society has revealed that young people have become more concerned about the cost of living than the state of the environment or even crime statistics. More than 2 million children in the UK admitted that they were more worried about not having enough money than what the future of the environment looked like. Many young people were particularly nervous about what's on the horizon for the next 12 months, as more than 80% of those involved in the study said they were anxious about how the cost of living crisis would impact their family in the next year. What with these disturbing revelations, how can we make sense of the current state of our economy? Well, I'm now joined by David Paton, Professor of Industrial Economics at Nottingham University. David, thank you for joining me. First of all, do you think the worst is behind us on the inflation figures, or the increase in the oil price may feed through in a month or two?
Well, that is putting a bit of a blip in proceedings, but the long-term trend is for inflation to go down. It looks likely that Rishi Sunak will meet his target of halving inflation probably by the start or the early part of next year. It's not just the sort of headline inflation rate, the core inflation rate, which the ONS presents, which sort of strips out some of the more volatile aspects like energy and food, that went down quite significantly this month. So that's probably the figure that the Bank of England will pay more attention to than the headline figure. Although, as you say, that was surprisingly good news. Analysts were expecting a figure of about 7.2 perhaps, and it came in as a small reduction from last month, but down to 6.7, much lower than was predicted. So that is generally, I think, good news for the economy.
And that makes the Bank of England's decision on interest rates even more difficult, doesn't it? Because with figures moving in the right direction, should they keep the pressure up, or should they slightly take their foot off the brake?
Yeah, I think the Bank of England's got to be very careful, because interest rate increases take some time to feed through into the economy. So we've probably not seen the full hit from interest rate increases from the past few months yet on the economy. And the real danger for the economy is that further increases push us into recession. So I think there's now quite a strong case for the Bank of England at least to hold fire for a month or two. And the signs do look like inflation in the long term will continue to go down. So probably, I think the expectation is there'll be one more rise to go this week. I think the Bank of England might be better off just being a bit cautious, doing nothing this month, and then seeing how, if the good news continues on inflation, because the risk, as I said, really is about the impact on the economy now of recession. And we know we're at very low growth rates.
And do you think that's priced into sterling at the moment? Because obviously if sterling weakens too much, that becomes inflationary in itself. So if there were a delay in the interest rate increase that was expected until quite recently, can sterling take the pressure?
Yeah, it would probably hit sterling a little bit, which might, again, put pressure on import prices. I think the markets are pricing in probably one more rise, so they're expecting still a small rise tomorrow. Perhaps with the better than expected inflation figures today, the markets have probably factored in the chance now that the Bank of England will hold fire. I think the interest rate rises have different impacts on inflation though, because one of their consequences is it raises the cost of housing, it potentially increases mortgage prices, so that although the Bank of England hopes that higher interest rates sort of dampens down the economy, reduces activity, and therefore reduces pressure on prices. It's not all in that direction. So they have got to be very careful, I think. Interest rates have gone up a lot in a short period of time, and now's probably time to take stock and see at least for another month.
Well, thank you very much, David. With me now is my panel, Assistant Editor of London Financial Journal, Andy McDonald, and the writer and broadcaster, Benedict Spence. Andy, Rishi Sunak's going to meet his target. Great man.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, whilst he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he consistently missed it. I think he sent 6 or 7 letters to the Governor of the Bank of England whilst he was Chancellor, as inflation was slowly rising and then dramatically rising, saying, yeah, it's fine, it's all going to plan. There was a great article out, I think a couple of months ago, about how he kept reassuring the Bank of England that, yeah, it's fine, chill out, as they were raising it. So, yes and no, but I think it's gone marginally down. But realistically, the everyday person won't see that change. Tesco meal deals, for example, they raised those during the inflation hike. They're not going to go back down. A pint of milk, that's not going to go back down. And if we actually look at the everyday impact of the inflation hike, it's not going to be reduced.
And this very interesting survey that children, young people are very worried about the cost of living and more worried about it than green issues. That's quite a change, isn't it, in public perceptions?
Yeah, I guess so. I think the survey was done children aged 10 to 17. So obviously the impact of the cost of living crisis, the inflation hike will be directly applicable to them. But I reckon if you looked at the 18 to 21, maybe that university student, the environment might be slightly higher up, I think that's been demonstrated previously. But I think, 100% the recent inflation hike, it's gone down marginally, but it's not going to have a massive effect on the everyday working person. Maybe it'll have effect to the bottom line of some Wall Street brokers. But unfortunately, your people in like your constituency, for example, and other more urban constituencies, it's not going to help much.
But Andy's basically right, isn't it? Once prices have gone up, that increase is there, and you've got to earn more to be able to stand still.
Yes.
And therefore, even if inflation is coming down at 6.7%, you've still got to get quite a big pay rise to keep level.
It's still actually significantly higher than anybody would wish it to be. And just to go back to the topic of the survey about younger people being more concerned about this than things like the environment, I think that's very telling. Because, not to sort of go two-footed on net zero again, our attitude to net zero until today has been the attitude of a far wealthier country than we actually are. And you need to look back, and we do need to look before COVID at growth in this country. It has been stagnant. It's been stagnant across Europe, but that's beside the point. It has been stagnant here. And that is why I think people are really beginning to feel it, because there is still no real prospect of their wages catching up. And I think we also need to recognise that a lot of this is out of the Prime Minister's hands. I have a lot of sympathy for him on this, because everything is globalised now, and you are affected by price hikes and things like energy. We've had a very mild summer, relatively. I know everybody's saying that Europe's been on fire, but actually, crops have not been destroyed en masse as they were in previous years. So that will have affected the price of food. But during this period, of course, there has been the Black Sea grain deal, which has shipped 33 million tonnes of grain from Ukraine and Russia to the rest of the world. That has now come to an end. You are therefore likely, as is always the case in food production, a year later to feel the hit of that.
The children's survey is really interesting because children have been pretty much brainwashed to believe that greenery is everything. And it's fascinating that a poll has then come out that says, hold on a minute, we may have been told this stuff in school, but actually we see our parents struggling to pay their bills. We're much more concerned about the cost of living.
It always comes down to the pound in your pocket. And ultimately, where people will vote in the next general election based on whether or not they feel significantly poorer, or whether or not they notice that they got poorer and then it's got slightly better. That is what they will judge Rishi Sunak on, and he can have all these other pledges. Most of them, even though they are important, are fundamentally secondary to that. But, you pointed out that if you were to sort of go... it was you, actually, that pointed out if you were to sort of look at university students, they might be slightly different. Well, we're talking here about children who are living at home with mum and dad, who can see the effects of working families, not people who are living on a loan or a grant, and therefore are slightly isolated from that.
But these two stories come together as a very positive story for the Prime Minister, don't they? That people are worried about the cost of living. He's reacted to that. He's cutting back on green ambition in the short term. Young people accept this as an argument. He's really got his finger on the pulse of the nation's view.
Oh, I'd say yes on some things, perhaps on others no. I wouldn't say it's particularly positive, because whilst he was Chancellor, the situation became what it is today. So, yes, no, but I think it is... I'm not a supporter of Rishi Sunak, but if I was in his office and I saw this survey, I would feel slightly reassured that almost the next generation of voters had similar priorities to what the current Conservative Party seems to have.
I think the polling, because it's not been shifting, has finally sort of prompted him to be bold and say, look, trying to sort of steer the middle path and be everybody's best friend isn't going to work. You need to be bold. You need to appeal to what your voters want and what the ordinary members of the public want. And, that is what I think it boils down to. Now, is it a good day? We wait and see. I mean, you used the word brainwashed. I happen to think that a lot more people in this country would consider themselves environmentalists and are not entirely aware of what net zero necessarily involves yet. I don't think the full force of that has hit everybody. I think it's hitting some people, especially the poorest, but the middle classes, I don't think it's quite hit home yet so far. So we will have to wait and see actually what the impact of this will be. I think it's a gamble, but I'm glad he's made a gamble.
Well, I think actually if you look wider than net zero, in the wider kind of eco-environmentalism agenda, I think if you look at that, a lot of people in the Midlands and the North felt that in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, if you go all the way back to Thatcher, Major and Blair, when their industries were being shut down because it was cheaper and more efficient to do it to Europe. So I think actually this, almost like Brexit, this issue has been bubbling for a long, long time. A lot of people feel incredibly passionate about it because their industry it was stripped away in the name of this agenda.
Well, we saw this with Port Talbot the other day. Actually, there's visceral anger against net zero policies.
We were talking about this yesterday, and I'd happily go back to steel, but we're going to have to keep that for another night.